Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Strand. My name is Sabir. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still selling new and used books and hosting near 400 events a year. Tonight, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Adam Platt and to be celebrating the release of the Book of Eating, Adventures in Professional Gluttony. A summation of a life at the table, the Book of Eating delves into the lessons he's learned in the lifetime of experiences he's had, from growing up in places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan, living, traveling, and eating around the world, and becoming New York Magazine's food critic, where he won the James Beard Foundation Journalism Award for Restaurant Reviews in 2010. Joining him tonight is Amor Towles, author of The Rules of Civility, Even Hollywood, and A Gentleman in Moscow. They've become bestsellers and best books of the year as judged by the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them to Strand.
Thank you all for coming tonight to see the great Adam Platt.
Thank you, Amor. Do you guys know who Amor is? Like, you know who Amor is?
Well,
how many people are here to see Amor? Raise your hands. How many people are here to see me?
You're here to see Adam. Of course,
I
you're
win.
To see Adam.
I'm the winner. I'm the winner.
Appropriate.
We can all go home.
So, but I wanted to start our conversation. We're gonna have a conversation for about a half an hour, and then we're gonna open the floor to questions. As you all know, we are here because Adam has made this is an incredible achievement. It's a terrific book. As Daniel Halpern, his editor, would tell you, I think this was when he paid the first part of the advance 10 years ago, 15. What was it? It was a long. So when I say this is an epic journey,
it was literally like 20 years ago.
Yeah, you were like 14.
Where is Dan?
You collected the advance.
Where's Dan? Raise your hand, Dan.
Dan is back here.
He literally paid me like, I don't know,
$1,500. Yeah.
Or less.
But in 1970s money, that's a lot. But,
but this is true. And this is a true story. I said, Dan, and to my voracious agent, who thankfully is not here, I said, I don't want any money because this book's not going to get written.
Oh, yeah.
So don't pay me any money because I'm not going to write it.
Okay, yeah.
And he said, well, we have to pay you a little bit of money.
Yeah.
And this was back in 1970.
Yes.
So...
yeah, and here we are. So I wanted to start before I get into my first question. I wanted to share with the audience, and some of you may have seen this, is that is when, and we're going to get back to this later.
Walking around.
Yeah, but when, and I think this is 2014.
Do you always walk around?
Well, yeah, I'm going to pace back and forth. When in 2014, Adam very famously became, I really think, the first international food critic to come out.
Well,
can I say it in that way?
Well, no.
Which is on the cover of New York.
Say it in
on the cover of New York Magazine. He admitted what he looked like. So I want you to hold this for me.
Did you get this made?
Yeah. So
are you out of your mind?
So wait, no, you got to share it. You got to share it. So
that's it. Yeah.
So this was the cover of New York Magazine to announce that this is the face of the food critic. I will no longer go in disguise, which he was doing, fake mustaches, whatever.
I never did that.
False names, though. You did do false names.
Everybody does false names.
Okay.
I still do false names.
But so then the great thing is, and he talks about this in his memoir, we're going to talk about his memoir in a second, is that when this came out, his mother, I think it's your mother, right, says, "Oh my God."
Yep.
And she sends him this.
I can't believe it.
You have to hold that up. No, you have to hold it up because here we go.
I can't believe he did this. I got to take a picture of that. Hang on.
That's amazing, right?
I just turned my phone off. Hang on.
I just keep holding. It's like an Adam Platt sandwich. Here we are. Right? I mean, it's an amazing. How much that cost? Can you get on with it?
Sorry, go ahead. That's beautiful. Now,
Did you get the picture?
No. I turned my phone off.
Okay, we'll do that.
Do it later.
Okay, so my point is, and this is why I want to start the conversation, is obviously the mother's point
was holy shit. My mother was like, holy.
Adam is a notorious curmudgeon as a restaurant critic. And she said, you know, oh my God, it's you as a child, you as a baby, you were the same way then.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's what I want to start with.
And she sent me a big picture of that big mug. She sent me, you know, hi. It was, in many ways, it was like sort of a abnegation of motherhood. It's like, oh, you know.
It's not my fault.
No.
Right.
I mean, there's not a lot we could do with you. That is actually what she was saying. And fine.
Okay, so
I couldn't argue it.
Now you've said to me, I think you mentioned in the book, I don't know, but you said to me that you always wanted to be a magazine writer from
Correct.
a young age.
Very correct.
So I'd like you to open by talking a little bit about that trajectory. Why in God's name did you want to be a magazine writer? And then, but secondly, what is it about your personality that, because you have this kind of circuitous path to food criticism, what is it about your personality that made you, you know, that was the perfect landing spot for you?
Yeah, I think it was actually not just being a magazine writer, it was really being a critic, actually.
Okay, that was the desire.
As you can see from that picture, there is a certain dyspeptic distance on the world, which I already had. I mean, I like that face was for this guy putting a camera in my nose, like, what the hell is happening? And it is all in the book, and you know, but I grew up as my father was in the Foreign Service, and my mother also did that kind of work. She worked for NGOs and worked in adoption, and they traveled the world. Really, from when me and my brothers were 2 or 3 years old, literally through high school. I graduated from high school in Japan, and so we mostly lived in Asia, and we lived in Taiwan. We lived in Hong Kong for a very long time. My father was what's called a China hand, so he was a China specialist. And when we were very young, he went to Taiwan to learn Chinese. And I think the government still sends people to Taiwan. It's a city called Taichung, and they spend a year studying the spoken word and a year studying the written word. And my father used to say that you've learned a language once you start dreaming in it. And so they were like, you know, dreaming in it. But we rambunctious children were busy eating our way through the dumpling houses of, you know, wherever we were. And so I had that education. And also, and this is true of a lot of kids who I know who they're not kids anymore, but they grow up traveling in this sort of traveling world, which is quite glamorous and interesting, but it's also quite disconcerting, and you're on the fringes of things, and so they end up in professions that try and ape that. And the biggest one is journalism. I know there are many Foreign Service friends of mine who end up in journalism because you're sort of recreating this life, but you're being paid for it. And so it turned out that that's what, I always liked writing. My heroes were sort of the long-form nonfiction writers of the 70s and 60s. You know, the New Yorker writers, the Tom Wolfe, the Rolling Stone writers of the 70s. And so that's what I wanted to do. You know, it looked like fun. You know, you're traveling, you're writing these narrative stories, and then you do another one, and it seemed like fun to me.
So take us from the route from long-form journalism and magazine to food.
Yeah. Well, you know, like long-form journalism, even in my day, was no way to make a living, right? I mean, it's a very tough business. And so I would work from contract to contract, and I had an editor, and none of these contracts have health benefits, by the way. And I have an editor, and they never did. You know, E.B. White never got a health benefit in his life, I'm guessing. Anyway, but I made a lot of connections, and I wrote a whole variety of stuff. I wrote a diary column. I wrote travel writing in which a lot of food popped up, and so it was an editor at one of the magazines that I'd written for, and I'd written for her, who found herself at New York, and she this was in the early aughts, actually 2000. And New York had a longtime critic named Gail Green. You guys probably heard of Gail. And so Gail was famous. Gail was a eminence, a really sort of Tom Wolfe generation writer. And she announced her retirement in this grand way. And they tried to find somebody who would take her job. And I don't think they can find a lot of people. Anyway, so they said, Meredith, Meredith Kahn was her name at the time. She thought I'd make a good critic, good food critic, and so she called me up and said, "Would you like to try being a food critic, restaurant critic?" And I'd never even thought of it. And I was at a fairly advanced stage in life, But at that, it included all the things that I'd aspired to, like a real job with health benefits. And as a critic, what you get is this built-in world to cover. It's this, especially in New York, it's this merry-go-round world, whether it's theater, whether it's movies, certainly if it's restaurants. It's a great cultural sort of this rainbow of strange cultural stuff unfolding before you, and you don't have to fight to get your stuff into the publication. If you're a feature writer, you don't know this. He doesn't know this because he began as a celebrated novelist. So like, what the hell? Like, I'm a celebrated novelist. It's very easy. It's like all easy. But nonfiction, all these magazines, New Yorker, any magazine I work for, if you're a feature writer, you have to fight. But if you're a critic, you generally have your own little turf, and they'll leave you alone if you're lucky. So that's what happened. That's why I still have my job.
I'm going to find a thing you want to read here quickly. I think this is dead. Is this dead? Is this microphone working? Yeah. Okay, good, thanks.
It's all good. Mine's dead.
Yeah, right. Where is this? Okay, here we go. So I'm going to read this passage from the book, and the book is we're going to talk about a couple of different aspects of the book. But for those of you who have not read it, it is not kitchen confidential. It's not sort of a one restaurant after another, or the life of the restaurants one after another. One of the things about it is it's a very humane book. I mean, it's at least half or a third about Adam's relationship to his family and food and how that has played out in his career. But then, of course, there's great comedy to it in terms of his investigations of the New York restaurant scene and of New York society generally. But I wanted to read this one passage to ask you a question about it. And this is about a paragraph, so I apologize. But what he says is, I would discover that the actual review, part cultural essay, part personal diary, part service journalism, and part travel and cultural commentary, involved bits and pieces of all the various styles of writing I'd attempted or failed at over the years. And I would discover as time went on that the job had a unique kind of magic to it, especially in a great dining metropolis like New York City, where it's possible, if you have a little money in your pocket, to sit in a newly opened mixology bar in the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn, say, or at the bar of an ancient steamy noodle stand or deli somewhere downtown, or at a grand linen-covered table at the latest gilded New Indian or French restaurant in Midtown Hotel, and watch the whole world unfold before your eyes. Now, first of all, I read that to say, Adam is a terrific writer, sentence by sentence. But you talk in the book about your heroes, Liebling, and what's his name? Jonathan Gold.
Jonathan Gold. The heroes, they're great writers. So.
And one of the observations you make, like for instance about Jonathan Gold, is that he's not just writing about food in Los Angeles. Right. In the end, he's writing about Los Angeles.
Correct.
And so I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about that as a food critic in New York. Right. To what degree are you writing about food in restaurants, and to what degree are you writing about New York, and how does that play out?
Well, when food writing's changed. Everything's changed with the great meteor that is the internet exploding in the middle of everything. It's changed everything. But when I first started, it was still this. Food writers were this sort of mannered, cosseted little group off to the side who, murmured to each other and quietly hated each other, and they were generally divided into two groups. There were the classic old-fashioned food writers who paid attention to what you were eating, right? The what was on the plate. The James Beard, Craig Claiborne most of the time, the great critics, the great, they were really focused on the plate. So they wrote about recipes, they wrote about, how to roast a chicken, then there was this other group, most of them who couldn't cook, didn't really care about cooking, And they wrote about the experience. They wrote the experience of a great meal, the experience of a great meal traveling around the world, et cetera, et cetera. Trillen, obviously, Calvin Trillen, who famously said, "I don't cook." Like, why would I cook? I'm not a cook. Like, I'm a writer, and I'm actually writing about the culture, and I'm exploring things through food. Liebling is the same way. I think Jonathan Gold of the LA Times, he cooked a little bit, but these were writers. And so the writing was their medium, and you're still when you're a food writer, like, you're a food writer, so you're a writer. It's your medium. So I figured that if I was going to survive at all, and also give my background, I would have to sort of try and tiptoe into this. I call it the experiential school of food writing, and so that's what I tried to do, and I still try to do it in a formulaic way. I still try and find, when I write a review, I try and find a theme and how this restaurant fits into maybe what's going on food-wise around the city, and then I try and lead. Try and set the scene, because Ruth Reichel famously said, most of these people aren't going to go to your restaurant. Or they're not going to spend $500. They're going to, they want to see, they want to experience vicariously this crazy thing that is New York dining. So you try and create that, and then you try and lead the people who might be crazy enough to pay $400 or $500 or $100 or whatever. I mean, 100, whatever. You try and you have to tell them what's good and what's bad. So it's a combination of things. But really, I've always been interested in writing about the culture and the figure that I've tried to. I try to sort of. I have this figure that sort of wanders the city, and that's how I try and play it, like wandering around in my sauce-stained coat, and I mean, I will say that in New York, it's much easier to do that than elsewhere. I mean, New York, the dining culture, I mean, even today, I mean, they're all, what's happened, I mean, if you want to, I'll just talk a bit about the food world. In my 20 years, which was a very long time, when I first started, the classic, the restaurants that everybody was admiring, and the destination restaurants, the kitchens were cosseted off. They were in the back. You rarely saw the chef unless it was a fake Frenchman or a real Frenchman or somebody. He came out and bowed like a magician and then went back and, patted a few people. They went back. But the front of the house was really run by these, these impresarios. They were like Broadway producers. Sirio Macchioni at Le Cirque. Danny Meyer is a classic one. He still does. He's sort of one of the last types who does that. And in these 20 years, what happened is the kitchen culture literally moved out not into the center of the restaurants. Many of these restaurants, the kitchens are in the middle of them, right? And we're all around it watching this pageantry and watching this play. But the culture of the kitchen has also moved out into the center. Really, the center, it's in the middle of the popular culture, and all the foods that the chefs used to talk about late at night while they were getting tattoos or whatever they were doing, like the perfect burger, the perfect ramen bowl, the perfect pork chop, have become the currency of the post-gourmet world. And so, that's interesting.
One of the things that's associated with that development that you talk about is kind of the end of authority in criticism. Right. Yeah. So can you explain that?
Well, criticism. That's authority
in food criticism, maybe. Yeah. But it's happening all over.
Yeah. It's all part of the great meteor. Like I'm use metaphors endlessly, and the great meteor, the great social media, whatever it is, internet meteor. On the one hand, you had this break. In the food world, you had this new generation coming up, who, partially in thanks to the rocket fuel of social media, was much more comfortable making their own choices about where to eat. Their parents would listen to these fake Frenchmen in tuxedos tell them to eat a souffle, or whatever the hell it was. And they'll go, yeah, sure, yeah. Whatever, monsieur. But their kids who grew up on, I call them the Starbucks generation. They went to Starbucks is a very sophisticated restaurant operation. You got to know, you got your half calf, bat, you got to know the beans and where they were roasted, whatever the crap, But you take charge, right? And so this generation is taking charge, and they want a different kind of stuff. They like comfort. They like all the ingredients. They're very interested in the political, angle of stuff. And so it's just a different style, and the old fancy stuffy stuff they're just not interested in at all. So they're really in many ways more sophisticated than what came before them, but they're simpler. And so you have good food available all over the country now, because it's not so focused I'll talk about the critic in a minute, but it used to be very New York centric. Like people would come, just like in any art, people would come to New York to make their reputation. New York is a great dining town, but it's not a very adventurous dining town. New York's you like steaks, we like stuff. But what you do in New York is in New York, you would curate the fashion and send it out into the world, and that's what the restaurant critics used to do in whatever, at ballet, whatever. And with the internet, that's no longer the case. And the internet has, I think the role has changed. The old critics like me, and if you're a restaurant critic, it really depends. If you have an expense account, I think you're sort of a real restaurant critic. I'm not going to say if you don't. Everybody's a critic. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. But if you have a real restaurant, if you're paying your own money, or your company is, or your whatever, then you are entitled to your opinion is independent. You're not getting fed. You're not getting, and so I think what I try to say is like our role has changed from being sort of the outliers, sort of shining or creaky. I think this is another metaphor I use in the book. Our miner's lamps. Ruth Reichel would they'd find this great thing with their miner's lamps buried down below, and they'd write the story, and a month later they'd publish it, and everybody would follow. They'd go to that perfect restaurant in Provence or whatever it is. Now everybody knows about the perfect restaurant. There's 1,000 perfect restaurants, and now the critic's role, if he's lucky, or if I say that's our role, is to come along afterwards. Pete Wells at the Times is a genius at doing this, coming along afterwards and telling you that this, in fact, is where you should go. Sort of cutting through the fog. So that's what I try to do.
And that relates to also being the cultural critic as not just a restaurant recommender, right, but a cultural critic, because that's something that not all bloggers will be focused on.
I love bloggers. I mean, it's all good. It's a big merry family. It's just a different metabolism. It's just a different, you have to write in a different way to get people's attention online, because it's a much more fickle, bigger. It's like schools of fish flying around. They're just, so you have to write shorter, and you have to write more punchy. And I talk about this in the book. The idea in my world, I grew up in a world where print journalists would write something and turn their backs. They didn't want anybody talking to them. Like, I don't want to talk to you. Like, you want to hear, you want to have an opinion on what I wrote? I'm not interested in your opinion. I don't want to talk to anybody. And, about literally 15 years ago, it changed to, I want you to talk about it. It's like, I want to create what they call the conversation. And so that is what the great online writers are adept at. They create a conversation, they create controversy, they get people screaming at them. And I'll talk about Wells again. That's what he's adept at doing that too. It's like his Peter Luger review was a classic example of that.
Right. Are you good at that too?
No.
Okay.
Well, nobody cares about me in that sense.
Right. Okay.
I mean, they sort of do, but they really don't. Maybe, I don't know. No.
No, yeah, a little bit. Yes.
Nah, well, not like that. You guys know Peter Luger's, right? This horrible steakhouse in Brooklyn where they treat you horribly. I've written that 100 times. Like, I have a listicle on steakhouses that I update. I think I first published it like 5 or 6 years ago. Luger is like number 12 forever. I've always disliked Luger. But when the Grand Eminence leaves his castle and makes his pronouncement, it's different.
National news.
Different.
Right. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, which is kind of related to this sort of evolution that we've been going through, about this moment when you end up on the front cover of New York Magazine, unmasking yourself. But before you talk about that decision and kind of what was around it and whether it was a real decision or not or whatever, can you talk about Andre Duffy.
Well, they've made various last names.
You talk at length about
Correct.
the personality of Andre Duffy.
Correct.
You have a vision of who he was
Correct.
or who he is.
Yeah.
So can you introduce everybody to Andre Duffy and talk about kind of his role in your writing,
right,
and then the evolution towards that moment where I don't know, does Duffy die when you end up on the cover of the magazine?
No.
But anyway, okay. So walk us through this.
This is a long I can go on and on.
Yeah, if you don't know Andre Duffy, you should meet
when
Andre Duffy.
When I write in the book, the first chapter of the book is mostly about this meal that I had with Gail Green, when she very nicely asked me to lunch at a restaurant by a great chef called classic French chef called Alain Ducasse. This was in 2000. This is a time when still people worshipped the altar of the continental model and French cooking, and the French chefs, when they came to New York, were greeted like popes by the foodie community, and bowed down, kissed their rings, whatever. And so this was Ducasse came to New York, and it was front page news on the Times, it was front page news in Paris even. And Ducasse is still the grandest chef. He's got the most Michelin stars, whatever. And so she invited me to lunch at this place, right? And I show up. And Gail was also famous for her hats. Like, hats were her thing, her calling card. Like, she wore hats so nobody could see her. Of course, they all knew that she's the only person wearing a hat. So they all knew who Gail was. Anyway, so she said, ask for Rebecca Lemos. And so I show up and I say, hi, Miss Lemos. And she goes, nah. She's all by herself, no hat. You couldn't get into this restaurant. There was like a 6-month waiting list, but Gail miraculously got in. So she's there. The Lemos stuff went out the window. We're having a nice meal. Well, it's somewhat stilted because she's working, and she's also quite an august figure in her, whatever. And so I'm just sitting there, trying to make conversation, and she's correcting me on things. Like, I say, I'll have the prefix. And she goes, prefix. It's a prefix. And then silence. So I'm like, okay, whatever. And then lunch goes on, and Ducasse comes out. Little guy, nice guy, pops out, and Gail, mon ami, they hug. I go, it's a weird thing. Isn't she supposed to be disguised? And she introduces me. She goes, this is my friend Andre. I was like, and then she said, Andre Duffy. And I may have added Duffy. So I was like, whatever. Oh, this is weird, And so I created. First of all, I came home and I told Kate, my wife. I told my friends, this is a weird story. So I've been dining out for a long time, and so I created in my mind, partially to make me feel sort of at ease or better about this crazy job, this alter ego named Andre Duffy. And Andre Duffy was a caricature of the restaurant critic who had suspenders and, suffered from gout and all of these things, and gold-tipped cane, and he strolled around. He was a very Liebling-esque figure. So I like to talk about Andre Duffy. And of course, in the book, I say over time I turned into Andre Duffy. That's really what I became, this sort of jowly guy with many food-related ailments who like to pontificate about whatever, my favorite market stall in Canton or whatever crap came into my head. So that's Andre Duffy, and it was a helpful foil.
And so then the decision to unmask yourself as a critic.
That was actually the editor of New York, who's a guy named Adam Moss, who's a genius in his way, and at this stage of the media apocalypse. Weekly magazines all put together if you were a restaurant critic, at the end of the year, you'd write a big package about your favorite places. It was called the year-end issue. Gail did it, and I used to call it the monster. It's 10,000s of words. It takes years to do. It's a horrible thing, but it became more and more problematic for them to market, and I think to advertisers, because there weren't any advertisers, and so. Adam, who was very smart about positioning New York online, he created all these different verticals, which they're called. He said, I'd gone out with him, and I was like, I would call this the Kabuki Dance that goes through. And he would you'd walk into a restaurant, and they go, they know who you are, right? Yeah, of course, they know who everybody is. So there's this whole dance where they know the restaurateurs know who you are, but they don't want to get upset. And you have to read the book. It's all this crazy thing, and then it's part of the ecosystem. They think that if they're nice to you and don't get mad, then you'll review their next restaurant well, and you're all sort of, anyway. So he goes, we're doing away with that bullshit. I'm putting it on the cover, and yes or no? Are you on or are you off? And I go, I didn't have a choice. Yeah. So it was his idea, and he wanted to create a conversation. Right, you want to create it, and so that's how it happened. And the whole thing about anonymity, which critics like to talk about, I think it is an ideal. It's a great thing to be anonymous because, you were treated differently. Ruth Reichl wrote a famous review, double pronged review, where she reviewed Le Cirque from the position of Ruth Reichl, and she went in and was fawned over, and the position of the person who was disguised. And they put her in a corner and treated her badly. Of course, if you talk to the people at the Cirque, they go, "Yeah, we knew she was that. We knew that was Ruth. She's dressed up as a witch or whatever." And we're or whatever. We're just going to leave. We're not going to. She's clearly disguised, so we're not going to. Anyway, but that was a great review. It showed you that these restaurants will pay attention to the people who are the regulars or the VIPs, and everybody else they'll treat a different way. And so, but it's hard in New York. It's hard to get around it, especially if you're reviewing new restaurants. And the first 3 months, they know who you are. They literally pay people to find you, right? And and they're also treating everybody else like critics somewhat. They're giving everybody the best cut of this, the best cut of that, and they're trying to impress everybody. And it's when those 3 months are up. And like Le Cirque, like Peter Luger, where they don't really care anymore, when a good critic can come in and they're not going to recognize. I'm sure Luger's, if Ruth Reichl walked in with a sign saying "I'm Ruth Reichl," they wouldn't give a crap. They wouldn't even know who that was. They just feed her, bad steak and jostle her and yell at her. And they don't care. So that's when real anonymity works. And New York is always the magazine's always fixated on the news. So I'm always doing new stuff. So anyway, that was Moss's idea, and it's fine.
I have one more question before we. Oh, you've dropped your hat, Sal. I have one more question before we open to the floor, and that is one of the pleasures in the book is that at different stages, Adam kind of reviews what he sees as the sweeping changes that are going on in the New York restaurant environment, in food criticism, in food consumption, and consumer behavior, with at least 2, maybe 3 major waves over the course of your career. And I won't tell you.
I've already talked about them.
Yeah, we've talked about some of them already. I mean, the sort of the rise of the anonymous critic and sort of the changing role of the professional critic. But so I'm kind of interested in looking ahead. Where we are now and looking ahead 10 years. What do you see as being kind of what's evolving right now? What do you see as the likely changes in the New York City food scene?
That's a serious question
I
for
know.
me more.
Yeah, well, that's why I closed with it.
Are you like a food? I have no idea.
No idea.
This is what's happened. What's happened is like everything else with the internet. Like the establishment is worn away slowly, like a dissolving tower of sugar, and this great unruly democracy is in its place. So what happens now, if you're a fancy critic, I'll just use the star system, which I talk about in the restaurant in the book. I hate the star. Critics all hate the star systems. They hate 4 stars. They hate 5 stars. They hate 2. They hate it because it's being a restaurant critic is among all of the critic disciplines. It's really the most subjective. Like the way you're treated at a restaurant, the enjoyment of your meal depends on all these variables, which change all the time. It depends on where you sit, what time you're eating, what you like, whether the chef is there. There's all these variables changing all the time. Whereas book critics and restaurant critics, and movie critics, they see the same product, right? So it's always changing, and the star system is designed to give this illusion of solidity, which we all know is a farce. But people like it it brings business to the chefs love it, readers like it. And we didn't have it when I started writing, and then I was told to do it, and I created a star system, a 5-star star system. They told me, we want you to be like the Times, but not quite like the Times. So I created a 5-star system, and I never gave 5 stars. I gave 5 stars only twice, and the next year I took them both away. So the hell with your star system. And I made it as opaque and weird as I could. Anyway, if you like the star system, nowadays it's all 2 and 1 star. And the other thing about stars is they're really they're a category for restaurants. If it's fancy, they're going to give it 5 stars. Like the classic Craig Claiborne, who invented the time system, or Michelin, they're really talking about a category of restaurant. Like the more money, the more fancy, the more ambitious, the more stars. Now that's all different. What I'm talking about, the way the younger generation values food, the way it's a whole different thing. And so you have in New York a bunch of 2-star restaurants, which are all great, and they're everywhere. You can have a great meal wherever you go. You have a great meal. You can have great meals in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., believe it or not, or in Atlanta. The food community is just spread everywhere, and it's really a cultural, generational message. And so for critics, it's hard to differentiate and to sell what you're reviewing. But for diners, it's a golden age. It's a golden age for everything. It's a golden age for whiskey makers, for pickle makers, for beer makers. It's a artisanal whiskey is, great whiskey is made in Brooklyn. That wasn't around when I was starting out. So I think more of that. Right, and probably less and less of the destination. I'll just end with this one thing: the destination restaurants now, and you can see it in New York because the grand destination restaurants in New York. I'll just take 11 Madison Park as an example. They've turned into, they're not New York restaurants anymore. They're international destinations, like the top 50 restaurant listicle, which is religiously followed by these gastronauts who travel the globe, checking it off. And so the restaurants are now designed for the tastes of those diners. So they tend to become less like New York and more like this sort of ethereal, rich person's world. And 11 Madison Park was a great restaurant, but now, when I started, Danny used to own it when I started, it was a very New York restaurant, and now it's like, I don't know, it looks like a hotel lobby in Shanghai, sort of. And that's who's dining there, right? It's still a great restaurant, but the flavor, the intrinsic terroir is lost and is more manufactured now. So, yeah. Okay. Questions?
So please, do you have any questions from the floor?
If you just raise your hand, I can run the mic to you.
Nobody's raising their hand. All right, that's good. Okay.
I'll ask a question. Adam, veganism, is that going to be a thing that grows and becomes popular in society?
Yes.
Or,
Yep.
Tell us what you think is going to happen with it.
Blowing up. No. Thank you for the questions, Steve.
You're welcome.
It's my apartment mate who I saw in the gym today. I said, you better come to this goddamn reading. And he bought like 10 people. Thank you. Veganism veganism has a real cultural political message, right? And it attracts more and more people. It's good for you, so I hear. The vegetarian legumes have been trendy in haute dining circles for more than a decade now. And I call it the vegan army. Like, the vegan army's been on the march for a long time, and they're only going to conquer more and more territory. And I'm going to have to retire from the field. As a beaten I want to be a vegan now. Like, that's how bad things have become. Like, I want to or enough. I want to be healthy. I don't know if it's a little, yeah. But the answer is yes. More and more veganism.
In the same way that big food has kind of fragmented into, and you've got a rise of specialty manufacturers, can you talk about whether there's an analogous trend in the restaurant business and actually how sustainable that is, given that you can't be all things to all people and something might be fad for a little time, but may not have the legs?
Yeah, well, the other thing, aside from veganism, like the big trend, if there is a trend in the food world, in the restaurant world, I'm really talking about restaurants, right? I'm talking about quite rarefied restaurants. Even a 2-star restaurant in New York is relatively rarefied compared to, giant hog slaughtering, plant in South Carolina. So, but the real, the fundamental trend has been farm to table, obviously, and it started all over the place. But really, Tom Colicchio's Craft was a restaurant which did what New York does. It took these things that, again, chefs have been muttering about, chefs cared about, and the French chefs cared about. They just didn't talk about it. Seasonal stuff, technique, the perfect mushroom, the perfect eggplant, whatever, and it raised it up into the level of New York snobbery, like to something that the New Yorkers could understand. And then that was relayed out into the country. Like, this is how you, and that's just been going on and on. Dan Barber's great Blue Hill restaurant out in Westchester. And I think that, it's all designed to circumvent big food, right? It's a political statement. It's like, this is how we want to live. And I don't see that really changing, no matter who's in the White House.
Hi. How do you think street food writing and just street food in general compares to writing about restaurants?
Better and better. So like street food, like I'm not a big food truck fan because I'm just from New York. I used to have this thing like I never had anything good out of a truck. So that's not popular. It's wrong actually. Maybe I don't know. Whatever. But certainly in the last 10 years, and Jonathan Gold, who I talked about, who was the LA critic I talked about, and he has many adherents. And Gold, snooped around. Gold was what's classically called a cheap eats writer, right? You had people like me who wrote in our magazine. It's $25 entrees and up. That's what I wrote about, and I think my colleagues, they left. But anyway, Rob, they're shy. Rob Patch and they were sitting right there. They do under 25, right? So they call themselves cheap eats, but whatever. And that was Gold. But Gold raised it. He saw that this was and I think Gold was like what I was talking about, the kind of writer who wanted to write about the scene. He saw that this is a window into the culture, especially in a place like LA where it's so spread out and diverse. And so the quote-unquote street food writers have become really much more they're much more popular now than the fancy writers because they're more in touch with what's going on, because like everything we do live in a golden age of, I'll call it ethnic food, I'll call it Mexican, whatever you want to call it. That kind of food has been discovered by critics and they're raising it to the level of what the fancy French stuff would be. So it's another huge explosion, also brought on by the internet, and it's not going to stop.
Yeah. I know that some critics, when they have a bad restaurant experience, will choose to not write about it, and some will choose to write about it. I guess, like, what makes you write about a bad experience? Or when do you, like, crush a restaurant?
Well, I write about this in the book. It's a good question because often you go to a lot of average restaurants, not so good restaurants. And it was a restaurant here years ago. It was on University Place. I think it was a Japanese restaurant. And as a critic, you're always looking for crazy things to order. And so it was a subterranean restaurant. So you went down into it, and they had something called Squid Risotto. Like, that's a weird thing in a Japanese restaurant. I'll order Squid Risotto. You're all looking weird. Like, what's this going to look like? And so it arrived. It was a giant hollowed out squid carcass filled with gummy risotto. It was like, oh my God. And as we were looking at this thing, like something happened in the kitchen, and the backdraft from the kitchen spewed out into this little subterranean space. So it was like cloud, and then the chef started to scream, like ah, like a submarine captain whose ship was on fire. It's like ah, and I was like, see you later. You know, and it's like, but that guy, you know, these restaurants in general with the bad reviews, like you just you go to them, and if they're not, even if they're not great, if they're just okay, you don't write about them. And I find that the negative reviews I wrote, I mean, there's an old rule in journalism that you comfort the afflicted and you afflict the comfortable. It's an old rule. And I think it applies with restaurant critics too, like Peter Luger's, like, you know, the hell with them. Like they're, you know, somebody has to tell the truth. So I tend to write more harshly or more critically about the restaurants that can afford it.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, Adam.
How are you?
I'm great.
Good.
I wanted to ask if, so you're writing about restaurants in New York. If you could write about restaurants in any other city, what would it be and why?
That's a good question. So, you know, there are a lot of places. I still think, I used to be a travel writer, and people would say, what's your favorite place to travel? And I would say India, because it was so madcap medieval, and I would say United States, because the culture is alive in the U.S. You go to Paris. I think Paris is a pretty boring place for a restaurant critic. Like the past is worshipped again and again. I think Rome is the same way. I think Italy is the same way. I think maybe the city that gets all the press now is like the place to go, and I say this in the book, is Houston, Texas. Great melting pot of both the immigrant cultures that I've been talking about, who have put down roots there, Vietnamese, Mexican, Chinese, Thai, and this very identifiable Southern American style of dining. I think in New Orleans also, people love to say New Orleans food is great, but they also, I think, worship the past. So Houston would be fun. Like, and I know that I talk about the critic. I was on a game show, a panel with, not a panel, it was a reality show with a critic from Houston, and she was like, you know, you got to come here. You know, and I follow her on Twitter and everything. It's like, my God, you know, it's this panoply of like interesting stuff. And the thing about New York is that it's so expensive now. The costs are so expensive. So another reason why the chefs don't come here to make their reputations anymore. They don't really have to. They go anywhere because the internet will find them. And so you have ambition everywhere. So I think maybe Houston. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you.